Hi, I'm Ella Ditzler.
I'm Grant Beck.
I'm Sarah Edistad.
And I'm Claire Fisher.
And this is our cultural immersion project. The primary community that we are associating with is the Asian community, and the question that we will be discussing is how have the events of the COVID-19 pandemic impacted the treatment and attitude towards the Asian community in the United States? And we will discuss our thesis in the research paper, which is as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, prejudice, xenophobia, hatred, and false accusations have been placed on the Asian American community in personal life and in social media, and this has affected their physical, emotional, and mental health. So we decided to research this topic because there has been a huge rise in Asian discrimination ever since news about the COVID-19 pandemic broke out. I want to say that there already was discrimination against this community, but because of this lockdown, there has been a huge increase in physical assaults against this community as well. And this can be seen in the tweet on the bottom right. So some of the assumptions that we had before doing this presentation are shown below. Mine, I believed that the Asian community that I saw throughout my daily life and on campus, that those people were recently immigrated and mostly came here to just get an education.
An assumption I had prior to this project is while on campus, I would just see groups of Asian people mingle amongst themselves. And so I just thought that Asian people usually stay within their own groups.
And my assumption that I put down was that Asian people are typically high achievers in school because that's just part of a stereotype. And I'd seen examples of that in my own life.
My prior assumptions is that the Asian Americans were not as heavily racially discriminated in the United States compared to others. And I guess to tie in with that, I think we can all agree that our assumptions were pretty far off. Anti-Asian hate is not something that's new. It's been going on for quite some time now, and COVID-19 has just really been a fuel for the fire, I guess, to say the least.
Yeah, so I definitely agree with that. And through all of the resources and media that I've read about or listened to, my assumption has definitely changed, and I've learned a lot on how to correct myself and my thoughts. I also learned that they are not a perpetual foreigner, that in fact they have been here for a very long time, and they even immigrated here at the beginning of the 1500s, which is a long time before some of the communities that came here, even some of the European Americans families. And so that's a huge misconception. And I also want to know about the Chinese Exclusion Act. Asian community is one of the only communities that have legal discrimination against themselves. And through this act, these immigrants and Chinese Americans had to exclude to themselves and could only talk to themselves and not associate with other Americans or get better jobs.
And I also found that my assumption was not always true. Like I said before, it is just a stereotype. You can find high achievers in every race. It just is a stereotype for Asian people because of the model minority idea. And this stereotype can actually be very harmful for the community because it puts increased pressure on Asian American students because they might feel like they have to achieve at a higher standard, which can also possibly lead to more mental health issues for the community down the road.
My assumption was also false due to the rise in COVID-19 and also the hate incidents that follows it. They tend to feel safest amongst their own groups, and there wasn't much conversation about any discrimination against them, so they found safety within their own communities.
So these are the immersion activities that I did. I watched the 9-man documentary, which is about a sport that takes place in Chinatown, specifically alleyways and parking lots. There are some very interesting rules and how this sport kind of got about and the traditions that come with it. One thing I found interesting was that 2/3 of the team have to be 100% Chinese. It came about or got very popular as a result of the Chinese Exclusion Act because the players could only associate with their Chinese community. Other videos I watched were how American and Chinese values shape the coronavirus response. And this is where Huang Heng, a Chinese media executive, talked about the different values and the different perspectives that each country has and how their government worked and what the lockdown looked like and how different they looked like because of that. I also watched an interview done by American Medical Association with Chinese American doctors and Asian doctors, and they gave real in-depth stories of their personal attacks and their anti-Asian sentiment that they've experienced, especially in the hospitals and by very racist patients when they're just trying to help. I also watched Asian Stereotypes, Rethinking Perceptions by Laura Lee, and she just talked about how stereotyped the Asian community is and how other cultures steal many of their traditions, the way they talk, the way they eat, what they read, and how they dress, and just how that can be very damaging to people's mental health and their thoughts about their culture. I also watched The Farewell, and this kind of goes with the TED Talk with Huang Hong because a Chinese grandma, she comes down with cancer, and her family is torn between telling her, not telling her, because Chinese tradition is to not tell the sick person that they're sick so the family can hold the emotional burden. And so one of her sons moved to Japan and one of her sons moved to America. And so they're in a constant battle of, do they tell her? Do they not tell her? What should we do? Do we follow Chinese tradition or not? And so it really highlights how the different worldview perspectives are based on where you live or where you grow up. And so I thought that was interesting. We can keep that in mind as we are writing our paper.
The immersion activities I have participated in below are listed below. Starting off with the YouTuber Frederick Chen. He's an Asian American YouTuber with over 725,000 subscribers. He shared his own experiences of anti-Asian racism, as well as used his platform to bring awareness to other people's stories. The podcast talked with professors about the rise in Asian hate, saying xenophobia and viruses pretty much go hand in hand. We've seen this with Ebola with Africans and SARS with Chinese. In the blog, May was Asian American, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders Heritage Month, as well as Mental Health Awareness Month. Due to social stigma and lack of specialized resources, Asians tend to not seek mental health help. Because of that, suicide is one of the leading causes of death in young Asian adults. The event I attended was a panel discussion given by Asian panelists who work in the tour industry in Chinatown. They have noted the large negative impact where people avoided Chinatown due to the stigma that COVID-19 is related to Asians, and specifically the Chinese. However, the community within Chinatown showed their strength, lifted each other up through the anti-Asian hate rhetoric, as well as taught self-defense lessons to combat this Asian hate. The documentary is on one of the panelists from the previous event, Cynthia Yi. She shared her story growing up in Chinatown and also included some of the dark history and spiritual connection with the past. And then finally, the movie that I watched is Crazy Rich Asians. I watched this because it was one of the first romantic comedies in years with Asian people as the leads, supported by an almost full Asian cast.
So for the immersion activities that I chose, the first one was a YouTube video. It was a late night show with Seth Meyers, and it had Ken Jeong in it. He pretty much just comes on and brings the current events that are going on in the United States. And this show was recorded in March, and it was right around the time of the Atlanta shootings. Something interesting to me that he brought up was that Asian American hate crimes had gone up in the United States by 150%. But meanwhile, overall hate crimes had gone down by 7%. So that just goes to show all the current events have been impacting Asian American hate. I followed two blogs. The first one was West Lafayette Rallies to Stop Asian Hate, and the second one was Asian Sororities Take Precautions Against Potential Hate Crimes. A big takeaway with the Asian sorority, Alpha Kappa Delta Phi, it's actually a sorority on Purdue's campus. They had been doing self-defense lessons just because they were so terrified that after hearing all the news of people just getting assaulted and stuff, they were like, we need to get prepared. The documentary I watched was Stop the Hate, The Rise in Violence Against Asian Americans. And the movie that I watched was Parasite. And I would highly recommend anybody watch the movie Parasite. It was really, really good. In terms of correlation with Asian American hate, it was not as prevalent, but it does have a lot of connections with minority groups and what it's like to come from poverty. Something that I took away from that was one of the main characters kept bringing up the idea that certain people have certain smells. There's this family and they're trying to hide, and he could smell them, and he was comparing them to people on the subway. As if there's a correlation between the way, poor people smell. And I just found that very impactful.
So for my immersion activities, firstly, I watched a documentary, Asian Americans. It was aired by PBS this year. It's a documentary that talks about the origins and history of Asian Americans, and as well as their accomplishments and roles in major events in the United States. it included many historical experts, and many of them were Asian American themselves, which was really impactful. And overall, it just left me with a far better understanding of Asian American history and how Asian Americans have helped shape our country into what it is today. Next, I watched 3 videos. The first of these was by Refinery 29. It was the struggles of being Asian American, which it was interviews of several Asian American women. Firstly, they talked about insecurities they had growing up as Asian American in the United States. Some of these insecurities included the meals that their parents would pack them because it was different than some of the things the other kids would get. Another thing they talked about was how classmates would pester them asking, "Where are you really from?" when really they were from somewhere in the United States. They also discussed that in Asia, there are 40 different countries, so Asian Americans can look very, very different. The next video I watched was what these Asian families love about their culture. It was interviews with several young children, which asked them just their favorite part of their family or what they do in their family. It highlighted many different foods that Asian American families may eat, as well as traditions they might have, which was really interesting. And finally, I also watched a TED Talk by Kanwen Shu, and she talked about how growing up in Denver, Colorado, she felt she had to conform to her white peers because that's all that she was surrounded by. And she began to reject parts of herself that fit the Asian stereotype because she didn't want to be seen like that. However, as she got older, she learned to embrace that part of herself. And in her own words, she described herself as a little bit American, a little bit Chinese, and a whole lot of both. And then I watched the movie Over the Moon, which is the story about a young girl in China who's struggling with the grief of losing her mother. And it's all centered around a Chinese legend that talks about a goddess who lives on the moon, and the main character goes to the goddess on the moon and ask for a wish. But my favorite part of the movie was that it included so many small parts of Chinese culture, such as the food they ate, or the way the family treated each other. So that was really interesting for me to watch. And finally, I was able to visit the Chinese American Museum of Chicago when I went to Chicago this summer. Mainly, the museum displayed different forms of art, which was common in China. So that was really interesting to look at. An example of that is the wooden dolls that's on the slide down there. There was also the stories of different people who live and work in Chinatown in Chicago. And this was by far my favorite immersion activity because you can't beat having a real life experience rather than having something online.
So these are our service learning projects, and me and Sarah went to Purdue's ARC, and this is where we folded tiny paper cranes for a larger ARC project where they are filling up a Purdue P with these cranes to kind of combine the Purdue's campus and the Asian community. These cranes are important to the Japanese community because it's a symbol of peace, and origami is a very well-known and practiced art in Japan. Also, there's a Japanese folklore where it says if you fold 1,000 paper cranes, then you get one wish granted.
So I would like to add on to that. The ARC is relatively new amongst the culture centers here at Purdue. It's opened in 2015 to provide a safe space for everyone, especially those who identify as Asian, which I definitely felt while working and folding these cranes with Ella.
For my service learning project, I created a brochure which compiled culturally competent and relevant mental health resources for Asian Americans. I wanted to do this because as I was doing my research, I found that Asian Americans were the least likely racial group to seek mental health help, even though mental health problem rates are equal with Asian Americans and other races. So the reason that is because of a cultural stigma against mental health, but also a lack of culturally competent and understanding mental health resources. So I created a brochure that included resources that were culturally competent, and I provided that to the Asian American Alliance, which is in Central Indy, for their Asian Fest, which is happening at the beginning of August.
And for my service learning project, after hearing about Ella and Sarah's experience, I really found that interesting and fun. So I decided to do the same thing. I folded origami cranes, and unfortunately, I'm not on campus this summer, so I had to do it virtually. And I found video resources through the ARC website.
So these are the interviews we did, and I did one with Manabu Takatani, which is the Purdue's ARC program administrator, and I wanted to ask him questions based on what he thought about the rise in anti-Asian sentiment after the pandemic and how he has personally experienced it both in person and online. I also wanted to know what he thought that Purdue's campus could do to raise racism awareness and like kind of how to defeat that and what we can do as allies to personally help them.
I had an interview with the ARC's director, Dr. Pamela Kesari. One of the key points that I wanted to mention is how the community is doing now compared to the beginning of the pandemic. So although the pandemic seems to be cooling down for us in America, those that have connections with people in Asia still feel the impact of COVID-19, such as having deaths and still facing large infection rates with low vaccinations. And I asked her like how we could help, and one of the things that she said is just to continue creating open conversations with those around you.
My interview was with Mari Yamaguchi, who's the senior manager of Asian American Alliance. Firstly, I asked her about the purpose of their organization, which she explained is to empower Asian Americans to serve and lead within their communities in the central Indy area. They also strive to create a space and platform where Asian Americans can feel embraced, empowered, and heard. I also asked her about the best way to support the Asian American community during this time, which she talked about how she's a strong believer in storytelling and that the best way to heal and bring people together is through the sharing and understanding of stories. So just being someone that Asian Americans can talk to and also someone who promotes the stories of Asian Americans could help inspire empathy and understanding within other people during this time.
So for my interview, I actually just gave ARC a phone call, and luckily I got to speak with the exact same person that Sarah did, Dr. Pamela Kesari. And one of the questions that kind of stands out compared to my teammates is that I asked if she believed that all the stuff that's going on right now, is it going to have a historical impact on the Asian American community? And she said that she thought that right now it's kind of shedding light on the Asian American community that it didn't have before. And long term, it should, potentially benefit the Asian American community, which is, I guess, a good takeaway from all of the bad.
So after hearing about all of this, you might be wondering about ways that we can help. After looking at many sources online, all of them said that the best thing you can do right now is check on Asian American colleagues and friends. Just let them know that you care. Because like I mentioned before, the American Psychological Association found that Asian Americans are the least likely to seek mental health treatment. So just being there for them and showing them that you care could go a long way in supporting them, at least a little bit during this time. Another thing that could be done right now is supporting Asian-owned businesses in cultural centers. According to CNBC, Asian-owned businesses have faced large economic issues during the pandemic and after the pandemic as a result partly of anti-Asian sentiment. So just making an effort to support these places could also help them recover from the pandemic. And finally, being able to address anti-Asian sentiment among friends and family. Although this might be a difficult conversation to have, it's also a necessary conversation to have. With violence against Asian Americans on the rise, it's just so necessary that we come together to work to solve the problem and have these conversations in a productive and informative way.
Some resources, both local and national, are listed below. The ARC, as I've mentioned before, has good resources for the Asian American community at Purdue. Dr. Sari told me about their work with CAPS, how they have 2 liaisons that they can connect students with. They work with the Career Center, and it's just an overall safe space. National resources include Stop AAPI Hate, which track and analyzes incidents of Asian hate. Asian Americans Advancing Justice, which works at the federal level to advocate for policy on civil rights impacting the Asian community. They also offered bystander intervention training, since only a small percentage of people actually intervene. And these are our works cited. Thank you for listening.